I worked in operations for a company that demanded precision from everyone except itself. The Boston office in January was a specific kind of hell. Gray building, gray sky, gray people moving through corridors that smelled like burnt coffee, and the particular exhaustion of people who had stopped believing their work mattered. I was good at my job, because I made it impossible not to be. I mapped supply chains like they were living systems. I created systems within systems. I caught problems before they became problems. I made my director look competent. I made my department run without friction. I made my salary, which was substantial. And then I made the decisions that would have required someone else's authority, except I always knew I could do it better, so I did. My family called it luck. My mother called it, well, Claire always lands on her feet. My father called it nothing, because he didn't ask questions about money that arrived. My older sister Lauren called it a given. I was the one who handled things while she planned her wedding. My younger sister Madison called it permission to send me increasingly aggressive text messages, asking if I could just cover her credit card overage, her phone bill, her share of the family vacation house. I was 32 years old and had been their infrastructure since I was 18. Not the emotional kind of infrastructure. I was never the person they called to cry to, and I never wanted to be. I was the structural kind, the financial kind, the kind that runs in the background so quietly that when it's working, no one notices it exists. And when it fails, the entire system collapses. The call came on a Thursday evening in late January. I was at my desk. Everyone else had gone to happy hour, which meant the office was empty enough that I could think, and empty enough that I was hyper-aware of my own presence in it. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical hum. Outside, snow was falling in that aggressive, purposeless way it does in Boston. The kind that's already half melted at the edges, brown by the time it hits the ground. I remember the exact quality of the silence because I was in a meeting transcript at the time, looking for a sentence that had been buried 3 paragraphs deep, the part where someone had made a commitment they hadn't followed through on. You'd be surprised how many times people's actual promises live in the middle of sentences, unremarked, untracked. My mother's voice came through the phone sounding exactly the way it always sounded. Reasonable, warm, betrayed by circumstance, and fundamentally unavailable to any reality that didn't center on her narrative. Claire, darling, I wanted to call you first because you should hear this from me. That phrase. I knew it before she ever said anything else. You should hear this from me meant that she had already decided how the truth should be presented, and I was supposed to receive it as a gift. 6 months earlier, I had sent $50,000 to my parents. The reason, as they presented it, was specific and urgent. My father had accrued some losses in a business venture. He had been told by a friend he'd met at the country club that he could get in on something substantial, and he never questioned things that made him feel important. And their cash flow had been damaged. I had already sent money the year before, another $35,000 for Lauren's wedding deposit. And the year before that, $20,000 for something my mother framed as an investment in the family beach property that never materialized. And the years before that, the house taxes when my father's consulting income ran short, my mother's medical procedures that insurance wouldn't cover, Madison's college tuition, and then her semester abroad, and then her apartment deposit in the city where she'd moved to find herself. I am aware that at some point, this became a choice. I am aware that I could have said no. I am aware that I was not forced, and that I was not threatened. I am aware of all of this with the part of my mind that is interested in understanding the mechanics of things. The other part of my mind, the smaller part, knew something else. That the invisible labor of holding up a family's infrastructure had become so normal that refusing it would feel like a moral failure on my part, not a reasonable boundary. This is what my family had taught me, and they had taught me well. There's been a change with the property, my mother said. The relocation costs for Lauren's move to Connecticut are higher than we anticipated. The movers, the deposit on the house, the furniture, it all came in above budget. And your father's business situation is more precarious than we realized. So we've made the decision to use the money you sent for his situation to cover Lauren's move instead. It's a better use of the capital, really. Lauren and Michael need the stability. Richard will just have to figure something else out. He's resourceful. I did not yell. I did not cry. I did not even move. I sat in my office chair, which was ergonomic and cost more than most people made in a month, and I felt the particular sensation of watching something crystallize in real time. The moment when a pattern you've been ignoring suddenly has a name. "Where is the money I sent for Father's losses, then?" I asked. My voice was level. I kept it that way deliberately. "Well, we had to use that for various things. Your father has already covered some of his losses with a loan. Michael's father helped, actually, which is why we can't ask Michael's family for more help, you understand. It's very delicate. The wedding was expensive, Claire, and now the property taxes are due, and Madison's school is asking for an additional payment, something about new facilities, and we really do need to help Lauren get settled in Connecticut. She's your sister, and Michael is a good man, but he doesn't have family money. We have to step up." Step up. The phrase hung in the air like something dead. I had stepped up for 23 years. I had stepped up when my father made choices that lost money, stepping up by keeping a spreadsheet of my parents' expenses so detailed that I could tell you what they'd spent on household supplies in March of 2014. I had stepped up when my mother decided she wanted to travel but couldn't afford it, stepping up by booking her trips and managing the logistics and absorbing the cost of that management into my own work. I had stepped up when Lauren needed help with her wedding, and then with her house, and then with her financial planning. I had stepped up when Madison needed someone to yell at about her spending, someone to set boundaries with, someone to care enough to enforce them. I had done that too, only to have my mother undermine every single boundary I set because Madison had a difficult temperament and responded better to encouragement. And now I was being asked to step up again. Not directly. My mother was too smart for that. Instead, I was being informed that the money I had already given, the money I had already sent, the money that represented a meaningful portion of my annual savings, had been reallocated without my consent or even my knowledge, and that this was practical. This was reasonable. This was what families did for each other. "I understand," I said. And I did understand. What I understood was that I had been funding a system that had no incentive to change. I understood that my competence had become a liability, because it meant that no matter what I sent, my family would spend more than it. I understood that my restraint about my own needs, the fact that I never asked for help, never mentioned my own financial goals, never implied that my money was anything other than an infinite resource, had been read as consent. I understood that I would keep doing this forever, or until I had nothing left to give. "Your father is very relieved," my mother said. "He was terribly stressed. And you know Lauren means well, but she's always been more sensitive than you. I just think everyone will sleep better knowing we've addressed these things. You'll figure out whatever you needed that money for. You always do." I got off the phone. I didn't say anything else. I didn't say goodbye. I just pressed the button and sat in the silence of the empty office and felt the way time moves when something inside you stops moving. Not a sudden stop, but a recognition of something that had already happened. I worked until midnight. I was good at not thinking about things when I had work to do. I finished the transcript analysis. I filed a report that identified 17 separate operational failures in our supply chain. Ones that had been quietly compounding for 6 months. Ones that my department had been silently absorbing by working harder. When the director saw that report, he would take it to his boss, and that would be the moment when everyone realized how much invisible work I had been doing all along. That would be a good moment, but I wasn't doing it for that moment. I was doing it because the work was there, and it needed doing, and I was capable. At home, I had an apartment in Boston that I could barely remember decorating. It was neutral and expensive and clean, because I hired someone to keep it that way. I had a car I barely drove. I had a 401k that was significantly padded, because I never spent money on the things people usually spent money on. I didn't have hobbies or relationships or obligations outside of work. I had a passport that had barely been used. I had a life that was structured with such precision that it could withstand almost any weight. Over the next 3 weeks, I did something that looked like continuing as normal. I went to the office. I completed my work. I returned my mother's calls with polite brevity and did not raise the subject of money again. I went to a required family dinner where my parents looked relieved to see me, relieved that I was not angry, relieved that the crisis had been averted, relieved that I was still functioning as designed. Lauren was glowing about Connecticut. Madison complained about her job with the certainty of someone who had never held one long enough to understand what it was for. My father made jokes about his situation with the club friends. He had already reframed the loss as a lesson learned, a story he could tell. My mother had already, in her own mind, converted my sacrifice into evidence of their family's closeness. I documented everything I had ever done for them, not in an accusatory way, in a logistical way. I created spreadsheets with dates and amounts and categories. I identified every password I had managed, every automatic payment I had set up, every piece of financial infrastructure I had built into their lives. I did this the way I did work, methodically, completely, with an intention to understand the full system before dismantling it. And then I began dismantling it. First, I stopped. I gave 2 months of notice that I would no longer be managing my parents' household expenses. I transferred all their bills and accounts to their own names and created a single handoff document with all the passwords. I calculated the amount that my father owed me in unpaid loans, not the gifts, the loans. $172,000 over 15 years. I did not ask for it. I simply made the number visible. I stopped covering Madison's expenses. I did this calmly, without lecture. When she texted asking me to cover her overage, I responded, "I'm not able to do that anymore. You'll need to call your parents." She called me 17 times over the next 2 weeks. I didn't answer. I reviewed my company's non-compete agreement. It was aggressive and broad and would restrict me from working in most of the continental United States for 2 years if I left. I read it the way I read everything, to understand its true implications, to identify the parts that had teeth and the parts that were posturing. Then I began researching countries where such restrictions would have no legal bearing. I had a conversation with my director. I told him I was considering a lateral move to a different division, something that would use my skill set differently. He offered me a promotion instead. More money, more authority, a team of my own. I told him I would need to think about it. What I was actually doing was buying time. I inherited money from my aunt, my father's sister, who died in early March. She had no children of her own, and she had always been the one family member who understood, really understood, what I was doing for everyone else. She left me $280,000. In her will, she had written a note. For Claire, so that she has somewhere to go. I had seen my aunt maybe 6 times in my entire life. She had lived in California, and we had never had conversations longer than 20 minutes. But she had understood. I did not tell my parents about the inheritance. I opened a new account in a different bank. I moved the money there. I started preparing my departure the way I would prepare any complex operation, with attention to detail, to sequencing, to the elimination of unexpected variables. I got a passport, a new one in case my old one was flagged. I consulted a lawyer about my options. I began researching firms in Buenos Aires and Singapore that hired American operations specialists. I wrote my resignation letter in draft form, and then I deleted it and rewrote it again, trying to find language that was professional but complete, that didn't explain or justify or soften the blow of my departure. I never found the right words. There weren't any. In the end, I wrote, "Effective April 30th, 2024, I will no longer be employed at this firm. Please see attached documentation for the transition of all my current accounts and responsibilities." I scheduled it to send at 5:47 p.m. on a Friday evening, the last possible moment to send it that would prevent my colleagues from immediately calling me, the first moment at which my director would see it while heading out for the weekend, the exact moment at which I would be boarding my flight to Miami. I cleaned my apartment with the consciousness that I would never live there again. I gave away everything that didn't fit in 2 suitcases. I left the keys in the landlord's mailbox with a note saying the lease could be terminated effective immediately, and that I would waive the security deposit. On the morning of my departure, I called my mother. It was early, 6:30 in the morning. I had timed it this way intentionally. "Claire, sweetheart, is something wrong?" "Everything is fine," I said. My voice was completely calm. "I wanted to let you know that I'm taking a position with a firm abroad. I'll be out of the country for the foreseeable future. I'll be transitioning all of my responsibilities to you. My last day of work is today. After that, my phone number will change. I'll be in touch if circumstances require it." There was a silence. In that silence, my mother was trying to construct a narrative that made sense, one where I was being difficult or impulsive or punishing her for some perceived slight. She was trying to find the angle where this was about her. "Claire, you can't just... What about the family? What about your father? He needs to manage his own finances and confront the consequences of his own decisions. What you all need to do is develop the capacity to solve your own problems. I'm not equipped to continue being the infrastructure of this family, and frankly, you've designed a situation that depends on my having no other choice. I'm making a different choice." "This is very unlike you," my mother said, and the cruelty of it was exactly what I expected. The suggestion that my departure was irrational, a deviation from my normal, stable self, when in fact it was the most rational thing I had ever done. "Please think about this. Talk to someone. This sounds like some kind of breakdown." "Goodbye, Mom." I hung up. I drove to the airport. I checked a bag, boarded a plane, and left the United States. For a while, I did nothing. I stayed in Buenos Aires in a hotel near the business district, and I did not get a job immediately. This was necessary. I was depleted in ways I was only beginning to understand. My body hurt, my neck, my lower back, my shoulders, in the specific way that holding tension for years makes you hurt. I had insomnia. I would wake at 3 in the morning with my heart racing, convinced that I had missed something, failed to manage something, left something undone. It took me 6 weeks to understand that nothing was actually wrong. My nervous system had simply been trained for so long to perceive failure as immanent, that absence of crisis felt like a precursor to crisis. I went to a doctor. I told her I was experiencing anxiety and sleep disturbance. She asked me about my life situation. I told her I had left my family and my country and had no plans to return. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, and then she said, "That sounds like grief, and also like self-preservation. Both of those are appropriate responses to loss." She prescribed something that helped me sleep. I took long walks through the city. I noticed things I was never quiet enough to notice before. I noticed the way light fell differently at different times of day. I noticed that I was terrible at sitting still without my mind creating things to worry about. I noticed that I had no idea who I was when I wasn't managing other people's crises. After 2 months, I reached out to a firm that had recruited me before, a supply chain and operations company called Meridian Group, with offices in South America and Southeast Asia. I told them I was looking for a permanent position. They remembered me. They offered me a role that was significantly more senior than what I'd had in Boston, with comparable pay and equity in the company. I accepted. Meridian Group was running a warehouse and fulfillment operation for an e-commerce firm across 5 countries in South America. They were losing money. Their systems were a disaster. Every operation was being run differently. There was no transparency into costs, no standardization of process, no central management. Their inventory was hemorrhaging. They were 6 months away from the kind of failure that would be obvious to external auditors and investors. I fixed it. This is not dramatic phrasing. I simply fixed it. I went to each operation, and I documented exactly what was happening. I created standardized processes. I identified the places where money was being stolen, casually, by people who saw opportunity, and I eliminated those opportunities through systems rather than accusations. I retrained personnel. I established metrics. Within 4 months, the operation was profitable. Within 8 months, we had expanded to 2 additional countries. My director was an Argentine man named Carlos, who had been brought in from another division. He was not used to being managed by someone who knew more than he did, but he was smart enough to understand that I was valuable. He gave me space. He also, I realized slowly, was interested in me in a way that was not about work. He would find reasons to have conversations. He would mention things about his own life that weren't relevant to any business situation. He asked me to dinner. I said no. I said it gently, but I said it absolutely. I told him that I worked for him and that it would create complications. He accepted this with grace, and I appreciated him for it. But it made me understand something about myself, that I had no interest in being anyone's anything outside of work. I had no interest in being known. I had no interest in the vulnerability that came with letting someone else matter. At the 1-year mark of my departure from Boston, my mother sent me an email. The subject line was, "Check in." The body of the email was short. "We would like to hear from you. Things have been difficult, and I think we need to talk about what happened and why. Please call me." I read this email twice, and then I deleted it. This was harder than it should have been. I expected that I would have moved beyond caring about what my mother wanted. I expected that I would have been healed or vindicated or transformed into something that could not be reached. But what I had become instead was someone who was simply no longer available for that particular kind of pain. The difference between not caring and actively refusing care is small, but it's real. The difficult things that had happened in my family were now obvious to them. My father had been forced to confront the actual mathematics of his spending. My mother had been forced to manage the household expenses herself, which meant discovering how much money she had actually been using. Lauren had needed to make the Connecticut move work without my logistical support, which meant calling me 17 times in a panic before accepting that I was not going to answer. Madison had hit some kind of bottom with her spending and had moved back home with my parents, unable to sustain an independent life. None of this was my responsibility. I understood this with absolute clarity. I also understood that watching it happen from a distance did not bring the satisfaction I might have expected. It was simply inevitable. When the infrastructure fails, the system collapses. This is not punishment. It is physics. What brought satisfaction was something else entirely. It was building something that worked. It was being one of 3 people who understood how a complex operation actually functioned. It was being compensated appropriately and having my work valued. It was having a calendar that reflected my priorities, rather than everyone else's emergencies. By year 2, I was driving the strategic direction for Meridian's South American operations. By year 3, I was being consulted on their Asia expansion. I was promoted to Vice President of Operations. My salary tripled. I traveled frequently to our offices across the region. I built a team of people who were competent and reliable, and I managed them with precision and respect. There was a moment in my 3rd year abroad when I understood that I could have stayed. I could have made this permanent. I could have built a life outside the reach of everything I had left behind. But by that point, something had shifted again. The goal had never been to hide. The goal had been to become untouchable. And untouchability, I had learned, required return. I was offered a position in the United States by Meridian's parent company, Director of Operations for the entire North American division, based in Chicago, significantly more authority and compensation than I had in South America. The non-compete had expired. No one could stop me. No one even knew I was coming back. I had changed. Not in obvious ways. I looked almost identical to how I had looked when I left Boston, but I had been remade by work and distance, and the particular clarity that comes from absolute necessity. I was colder than I had been. I was more certain. I was almost completely unreachable. In Chicago, I established myself methodically. I rented an apartment in a secure building with 24-hour concierge. I joined a quiet law firm as an advisor on corporate governance. I began consulting work on the side. I built redundancy into everything. Multiple income streams, multiple assets, multiple contingencies. I understood now that vulnerability was a choice, and I had chosen not to make it again. 6 months into my role at Meridian's North American headquarters, my former director from Boston, the man who had offered me a promotion when I was planning to leave, reached out to me. His name was David Reinhardt, and he was now the VP of operations at a competitor firm. He wanted me to consult on a major integration they were undertaking. He mentioned money. He mentioned that he was aware of my time abroad and that he'd heard good things about my work there. I said yes. The integration project was genuinely complicated, and it was also genuinely toxic. The competitor firm, let's call them Turner Industries, had acquired a smaller firm and was trying to absorb its operations. The two systems were fundamentally incompatible, but that was not actually the problem. The problem was that David Reinhardt had been spreading rumors about me. He had told people that I had abandoned my career in Boston because I was unstable. He had told people that my family had an intervention for me, and I had fled rather than face it. He had told the board at Turner Industries that I was brilliant, but fundamentally unreliable, and that I had a pattern of disappearing when things got difficult. He told them I was someone who couldn't handle pressure, who had run away to South America to avoid facing my own failings. He had done this because he was threatened by me. I had turned down his offer years ago, and he had interpreted that as a slight. My success abroad had been visible even from Boston. Meridian's growth had been newsworthy enough that consultants in his space had been following it. And now I was back, and I was positioned to become someone he would have to compete with in every arena. So he had decided to destroy me before I got a foothold. I found out about this in the way that competent people find out about things. Through documentation. Through a board member who mentioned it casually, the way you mention a rumor you heard. Through email forwards that had been sent to me but that I happened to open again while researching the Turner integration. Through a consultant who worked with David and told me, with genuine sympathy, that everyone knows that story about you, and honestly, most people think it's bullshit, but it's out there. My response was not anger. Anger would have been counterproductive. Instead, I did what I always do. I documented. I created a timeline. I identified the sources. I found the emails that David had sent misrepresenting my history. I gathered the evidence that the rumors were false. My departure letter from Boston, my background check, my clear employment history, my success metrics from Meridian. And then I did something that required patience. I completed the Turner integration project. I did it brilliantly. I identified the fundamental incompatibilities in the systems, and I created a path for merging them that cost significantly less than the current plan and reduced risk substantially. I presented this to the Turner board. Then I included, as a standard appendix, the detailed documentation of my background and professional history. And in a separate email to the Turner board, I said this: I have been made aware that Dr. Reinhardt has been circulating inaccurate information about my professional history. To address this directly, I did not leave my previous employer due to personal instability or family crisis. I made a deliberate strategic decision to develop my expertise internationally, which has proven to be valuable to companies like Meridian. I have attached documentation of my resignation, my employment history, and the metrics of my success abroad. I have also documented the emails from Dr. Reinhardt in which he misrepresents this history. I am bringing this to your attention because it bears on his credibility regarding other statements he may have made to your board. I did not ask for anything. I did not demand that David be fired. I did not suggest that he be removed. I simply made the truth visible in the most professional way possible, and I let the system work. David Reinhardt was terminated from Turner Industries 2 weeks later. Not because of what he said about me, but because the board had begun asking questions about other misrepresentations he had made. Turns out, if someone is willing to lie systematically about one person, they're willing to lie systematically about other things. His entire professional reputation, built on the kind of charisma that doesn't care about accuracy, collapsed the moment anyone actually looked underneath it. I did not feel good about this, but I did feel certain. I felt like someone who had understood how power actually works and had used it appropriately. By this point, 4 years had passed since I'd left Boston. My family had not contacted me in 2 years. My father had recovered from his financial situation by selling some property. My mother had adjusted to managing her own affairs. Lauren was settled in Connecticut with her family. Madison had gotten sober after a bad incident and had enrolled in a graduate program. They were, in other words, okay. I was not required to think about them. I was not required to feel anything about them. But my life was now positioned such that I could encounter them if I chose, and it would not matter. I was in a position of power. I was financially independent. I was essential to an operation that generated hundreds of millions in revenue. No one could access me without my permission. No one could hurt me by cutting me off because I did not depend on anyone for anything. This is when my mother called. It was a Monday morning. I was in my office, a corner office on the 32nd floor of a Chicago high-rise, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake. My assistant had put her through, which meant she had said it was an emergency. "Hello, Claire," my mother said. She was crying. Not the performative crying she did when she was trying to access my attention. Real crying, the kind that happens when someone is genuinely overwhelmed. "Hello," I said. I was neutral. I was careful not to invite anything into the space between us. "I know you don't want to talk to me. I know that I don't have a right to ask you for anything. But I wanted you to know that your father had a heart attack last week. He's fine. He had a stent. He's recovering. He's going to be okay. But it was scary, and it made me understand that time is—" She stopped. She collected herself. "I'm calling because life is short, and I wanted to say that I was wrong. I was wrong about the money, and I was wrong about how we treated you, and I was wrong to minimize what you did for us. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." I sat with this. I let the silence exist. My mother was waiting on the other end of the line, waiting to see if I would forgive her, waiting to be absolved, waiting to return to the relationship as it had been before I understood it clearly. "I appreciate you telling me that," I said. My voice was level and calm and completely impenetrable. "I'm glad that Father is recovering. I hope you're both well. Claire, I know that's not enough. And I know you have every right to be angry, but can we try to rebuild this? Can we try to have a relationship?" I thought about this. I thought about what it would cost me to say yes. I thought about the infrastructure that such a relationship would require, the emotional labor, the availability, the willingness to be needed. I thought about whether I had any desire to do that work. "I don't think that's possible," I said. "I'm not angry anymore, and that's important. But I've rebuilt my life in a way that doesn't include dependence on anyone, and I don't want to build dependence again. That's not about punishment. That's about understanding what works for me and what doesn't." "So you're just gone forever? You're never going to see us again?" "I don't know," I said. "Perhaps at some point, but not right now, and I need you to accept that without trying to change my mind." We got off the phone shortly after that. I had been kind, which was more than I owed her, and I had been clear, which was what she needed. I had not been cruel, because cruelty requires engagement, and I was no longer engaged. An hour later, I got an email from her, responding to something I had said during the conversation, something about understanding what works for me. She wrote, "I think you're the strongest person I know. I think you always were. I hope that at some point you can feel proud of yourself for that, instead of just angry with us." I read this email. I did not respond to it. I filed it away. And then I turned back to my work, which was waiting for me, which required my attention, which was real and tangible and could be understood completely. That evening, I was in my apartment, the one with the concierge and the security, the one I barely spent any time in, when I got a notification on my phone. Madison had texted me. "Mom said she talked to you. I don't expect you to respond, but I wanted you to know that I got sober, and I got into grad school, and I wouldn't have done either of those things if I didn't finally understand what you understood 4 years ago, that nobody else is going to save you. You have to save yourself." So thank you for being the example of that. I looked at this message for a long time. I thought about responding. I thought about calling her back. I thought about what connection might look like, what a relationship with my family might look like if it was built on terms that I had set, rather than terms that had been forced on me by circumstance and expectation. I decided not to. Not because I was cold, and not because I didn't care, but because I understood that my absence had been more valuable to Madison than my presence ever would have been. By disappearing, I had shown her that you don't have to fix other people. By rebuilding myself in isolation, I had shown her that survival doesn't require an audience. By returning powerful and untouchable, I had given her a different model of what a woman could be. That was the gift I could give her. Not presence, not relationship, not the infrastructure of a family, but the knowledge that extraction from that infrastructure was possible, that rebuilding was possible, that it was possible to become someone that even you would be proud to be. I got on a plane a month later to meet with the Meridian board. This was a trip to Singapore, and it took me through San Francisco, and I had several hours between flights. I was sitting in the first-class lounge, the kind of place where the carpet is soft and the coffee is free and the lighting is designed to make you look like your best self, when I received a message from my father. It was a photo. It was him and my mother, standing on a beach somewhere warmer than Boston, somewhere they had probably always wanted to go, but could never afford because they didn't manage money, and now they had learned to manage it. They were both smiling. The caption just said, "Miss you." I looked at this photo. I felt the pull of it, the desire to respond, to soften, to reach back across the distance and say something that would make them feel better. I felt the shape of the person I used to be, the one who would have sent them money for that beach trip, the one who would have managed the logistics, the one who would have made it possible. That person was gone. She had served her purpose. She had done the work that was necessary. And now there was someone else here instead. I took a screenshot of the photo. I saved it to a folder I created called Archive, and then I put my phone away. I finished my coffee. I watched the planes take off and land through the massive windows of the lounge. And I felt absolutely nothing. Not anger, not sadness, not satisfaction. Just the perfect, clean clarity of someone who had made a choice and was living with the consequences of it. That was who I was now. Someone who could feel nothing at all and understand it as freedom. Someone who could be needed and say no with absolute certainty. Someone who had taken everything that had been done to her and transformed it into power. Someone who had disappeared and returned, and nobody could touch her because she had made herself essential and also completely replaceable, at will. The gate for my connecting flight was called. I picked up my bag, and I walked toward the future the way I walked toward everything, with absolute certainty, with complete preparation, with the knowledge that whatever happened next, I would handle it exactly as it needed to be handled, and I would require nothing from anyone else to do it.